wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war and peace to the legislature and not the executive. Madison called it the crown jewel of Congress. The framers understood a simple truth. To the extent that war-making power devolves to one person, liberty dissolves. If the president believes military action against Venezuela is justified and needed, he should make the case and Congress should vote before American lives and treasure are spent on regime change in South America. Let's be honest about likely outcomes. Do we truly believe that Nicolás Maduro will be replaced by a modern-day George Washington? How did that work out in Cuba, Libya, Iraq, or Syria? Previous presidents told us to go to war over WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, that did not exist. Now it's the same playbook, except we're told that drugs are the WMDs. If it were about drugs, we'd bomb Mexico or China or Colombia, and the president would not have pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez. This is about oil and regime change. And when it comes to regime change, we've already been down this road with Venezuela with nothing to show for it. In 2019, we recognized Juan Guaido. We seized their embassy here in D.C. We were told that regime change was imminent. Years later, Maduro remains in power. Today, we're told to place our hopes in other exiled figures. Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado. I wish them well, I do. But Congress should not express moral sympathy in the form of a blank check for military escalation and American lives. And let's take a moment to acknowledge the contradiction at the heart of this policy. This administration tells us that the Maduro regime is made up of narco-terrorists, and by escalating toward war, we would predictably create countless refugees. At the same time, this administration has moved to end temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans and deports them back to the very regime it condemns. So which is it? Are we prepared to receive swarms of the 25 million Venezuelans who will likely become refugees and billions in American treasure that will be used to destroy and inevitably rebuild that nation? Do we want a miniature Afghanistan in the Western Hemisphere? If that cost is acceptable to this Congress, then we should vote on it as a voice of the people and in accordance with our Constitution. And yet today, here we aren't even voting on whether to declare war or authorize the use of military force. All we're voting on is a war powers resolution that strengthens the fabric of our republic by reasserting the plain and simple language in the Constitution that Congress must decide questions of war. I urge support for this resolution, and I yield back.
Well, everybody, I want to welcome you to a very important live stream. My name is Cyrus Jansen, and our world has fundamentally changed in the last 48 hours. I cannot stress the significance of what is happening right now in Venezuela and really in multiple countries around the world, as the United States President Donald Trump has made some moves that are honestly very much unprecedented and truly a shock to the entire international global world order. In today's live stream, we are going to be bringing in a fantastic guest who has ties to Venezuela, who is a Venezuelan national and has spent a lot of time there, obviously, that is going to give us a very good perspective of this. And I just want to, before we bring in our guest, Javier, I want to kind of give everybody my initial thoughts on that. Now, this clip that we just opened up the live stream with, this was from Republican Thomas Massie. He is a congressman who addressed Congress on December 17th, just a couple of weeks ago, as the United States was preparing, for this move into Venezuela. And this is, again, I just really want people to understand what's at stake here, because what we need to understand on the surface, a lot of people are just looking at this on the surface level. They're saying, look, Maduro's not a good guy. By the United States going in there and doing this, this is a net positive for the world. Donald Trump's doing a great job. America's super powerful. We're number one. That's awesome. That's certainly the line that Republicans and certainly the MAGA crowd wants you to believe. But what we really want to come at in today's stream is talking about the legality of this, and more importantly, what this means for the future of the world. Because what I believe is that Donald Trump has thrown the entire international rules-based order, which, let's not forget, this was largely put in place right after World War II. And again, we have to go back into our history. This is why we study history, because if you don't study it, it's bound to repeat itself. But the key thing with history is we look at World War I, and almost not very long after World War I, there was a Second World War, and the World War was devastating. It had an absolutely devastating effect, and we put in the policies and procedures in place that as the world continued to develop and we now had nuclear arms, that we would not destroy ourselves, and that we would actually have these systems and these protocols, and countries can go to war for specific reasons. And unfortunately, Donald Trump has absolutely rammed through all of those protocols. He has basically called his own shot. And as a United States citizen, if you are not concerned about this, then you are not concerned about our Constitution. You're not concerned about the legality of how this country is supposed to run. And that is very frightening, that we have a large amount of Americans that, again, are very, very supportive of his MAGA cult. They're very supportive of Donald Trump. But unfortunately, I think there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of things that people don't understand about this situation. And that is what we're going to be breaking down in today's video. I'm going to take a position, and I'm going to explain this theory later on in this stream, that Donald Trump is actually in a very weak position. He's in a very weak position. I'll explain why I say that in a little bit. But I want to introduce a very close friend of mine now to the channel. And I'm going to go ahead and bring him in. He's backstage, but we're going to bring Javier Correa to the show. Did I get the name right?
Yes, sir, you did. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Jansen.
All right, absolutely. Javier. So Javier and I, we first met a couple of years ago. We both met in Malaysia. You might have seen on the Nomad Capitalist channel, him and I did an interview a couple of months ago that did very well. Actually kind of went viral on TikTok with 5-6 million views. But, we talked about geopolitics. We talked about BRICS, China, the entire world order. But what makes Javier so special is that his background is incredible. He has so much knowledge on the law. He has so much knowledge on taxes, and he has, most importantly, he's from Venezuela. So if you guys really want to hear an insider's voice to what the situation in Venezuela is really like, I wanted to make sure that I brought you this authentic voice so that we can really understand how complex, because again, when we're discussing geopolitics, there's a lot of nuance involved. So Javier, welcome to the show and welcome to the live stream.
Thank you so much, Cyrus. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you and to be with all of the audience. Thank you really for organizing this. And definitely what you were saying earlier is right on point. I mean, geopolitics is complicated, and this goes, far beyond just something that happened in Venezuela. It can have tremendous ramifications throughout the world. And like you said, it really puts the entire geopolitical order in peril. Now, whether or not you believe the geopolitical order should evolve, that's an entirely separate debate. But what is true is that an action like the one the United States has taken in the past 48, 72 hours really it puts into question whether the international order is still truly functioning.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Javier. And I think that is what is very concerning here. So I think what we need to understand, as far as, Maduro, a lot of people in the United States, again, kind of from that right wing side is saying, look, this guy wasn't a good guy. We need to celebrate that this guy's not in power anymore. Javier, I think a lot of people are missing this because it's almost like they feel like, oh, we've changed the government overnight. But kind of give us a little bit of sense, because Javier, you were telling me before we went live, your mother is living right there in Caracas. She was awoken by the sounds of the bombing. Right. I think she called you, and that's how you found out about this. So kind of give me a little bit more, just play that out for our viewers. Like, how was that this morning? Like, tell me, what your mother's thinking. Tell me what your family, your initial reactions. Just take us back to that day, which of course was just a couple of days ago. But I want to get your view as a Venezuelan on like how you're just interpreting this in your country.
Yeah, of course. No, 100%. So for everyone to have a bit of a background, so like Cyrus said, I am a Venezuelan citizen. I travel on my Venezuelan passport. I go to Venezuela constantly. So I was just in Venezuela 2-3 weeks ago. I'm currently in Panama City, where I currently reside, but I go there often. I still have economic ties to the country. My mother is still there, as Cyrus was mentioning. So I definitely keep very much, I stay updated with what is happening in my homeland. And I do have definitely boots on the ground personally, so to speak. So basically, yeah, when this happened on January 3rd, essentially I got a call at around, I believe 2 or 2:30, 3 in the morning, something along those lines. And my mom calls me and she says, stay calm, but the bombs are falling, helicopters are flying everywhere, like there's aircraft. I mean, I don't know what's happening. And I immediately went on to turn on the news, looked at Instagram, etc. And what I saw was all of my people essentially in Venezuela uploading videos, stories to their Instagrams and things of that nature, or were sending videos on Telegram, WhatsApp, things of that nature, where they were literally showing how US aircraft were bombing several locations, strategic locations across the country, mainly in the capital city, Caracas, where I'm from. I was born and raised in Caracas, and also closer to the coast in an area called Higuerote. One of our housekeepers actually was there and actually also called me to tell me and inform me of the situation. She actually saw some US helicopters perform, direct military tasks in the region. So definitely, it's something that you think is never necessarily going to happen to you. Although obviously we were expecting this to an extent. I mean, we did see a very large US naval blockade, build up in the Caribbean Sea. I think around a third of the US Navy is right now anchored off the coast of Venezuela in the Caribbean. In fact, last time I saw you, Cyrus, when we did that interview where we talked about China and geopolitics, I had flown over that US naval blockade to actually reach you at that time in Malaysia. And so we were more or less expecting this, but you can never prepare for it. You can prepare for it to an extent. My family has truly become kind of like a prepper family. So we have backup generators, private water storage, food to last us for an extended period of time, because we've been through this before. Like I personally lived through the 2002 coup. I went through the social tensions of 2007. I did the whole Guaido era in 2019 in the Great Blackout, the great social uprising of 2014, 2017. I mean, we've been around the block more than a couple of times, but this definitely took it to another level. And as you correctly noted, so these military aircraft came in. I will say that the military side of it, the precision of the military strategy was impeccable. From what my mother can tell me, and she's on the ground, there was minimal collateral damage to civilian infrastructure and to civilians in general. It was kept mostly 99.9% truly to military targets. And I understand it was U.S. Delta Force that came in. Drones, fighter jets, escorting Delta Force aircraft, helicopters. They went down. They found where Maduro was staying, I guess, for the night, his secure house, his safe house. They went in, they took him, almost like in the movie Air Force One with Harrison Ford, the intro scene. They took him into custody and they flew him out of the country to a U.S. naval warship, which then subsequently carried him to the United States, where he is currently being held in New York City.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is. It's actually quite unbelievable. And I don't know if everybody's familiar with the TV show Jack Ryan. They actually had a very similar season 2 of Jack Ryan, which is all about the CIA, and they're having all of these different military coups in here, and I think unfortunately, this is a lot of this actually has to play into how the U.S. government really prepares the United States citizens. Jack Ryan, incredibly popular show in the United States. And, all of a sudden it's a little bit of this subtle brainwashing that we get here in the United States where, we're obviously portraying Venezuela, and we obviously look at Russia, Iran, many countries. You look at a country like Russia, for example, in every movie, Russia is always the bad guy, right? It's always the Russians. And even if you look at a movie like Top Gun, which would probably be one of the most famous U.S. military movies of all time, actually, if you watch the movie, the plot's terrible. Like, there's not an actual plot. It's literally this random plane comes over a mountain, and all of a sudden it's a Russian guy. And then, Tom Cruise has to take him down. He takes down the plane, saves the day. America's the best. And so, you watch that movie, which was back from the 80s, and you realize it's like, wow, that was a terrible plot. But that was actually the enrollment to the U.S. military surged after that movie came out, okay? Because all the guys were like, man, I want to be a Top Gun pilot. I want to go fight for America. So again, this is, again, a little bit of this soft power culture here in the United States where we're, really, conditioning people very well. And I think it's, I mean, again, for me, Javier, as a U.S. citizen, I'm actually on the road as well. I'm actually in Quebec City up in Canada. I'm making my way back home as well. But we've been traveling a couple of weeks with my family over the Christmas we got 2 more days here in Canada before we go back to the United States. But it is, quite a shocking thing to wake up in the morning, especially as a geopolitical YouTuber. I'm like, wow, we need to, we're going to have to get on the stream and talk about this. But, what's really happening here is, again, if we want to go to the legality of this, Javier, I want to look at from the United States. when we're seeing, if you want to go to war, right? If we want to actually declare war and we want to make these moves, you cannot just simply go in to a sovereign country and remove a head of state and then all of a sudden just bring them back to New York. Now, the big thing here is a lot of people, and certainly what the line from the government right now is that this is all about narcotics, right? This is all about drugs. But the interesting thing is that if we look at the data, Venezuela is not a very big hub, for narcotics. I mean, if anything, there's actually a little bit of, cocaine that comes, very small amounts, but it's certainly not fentanyl, which is the biggest problem that we're receiving right now. So, but of course, this is where the propaganda and the kind of the blur in the media is, because right now, we're saying, okay, fentanyl kills people. There's fentanyl. We've seen even in the bombing of these fishing boats, right? The same thing happened. Before, if there is a fishing boat that is going to be illegally trafficking drug, there's due process, right? You cannot just go out and bomb this random fishing boat and take out these people. You actually have to arrest them. You have to do an inspection. You have to see if there is narcotics on there. They have right to a trial. They have to, again, this is kind of going back to how our society is going to function and how international law is going to function. But again, we see Trump overstepping that boundary, just simply saying, take him out. It was the, what was it? The double tap, missiles, just take him out. And then all of a sudden, some of those missiles, some of those boats that were destroyed were innocent civilians. They were not actually drug traffickers.
Yeah, no,
and so,
I really think that you're touching on something big here. And I think that people need to understand that this has to be seen from a legal perspective in two dimensions, right?
Okay.
Number one, you've got internal U.S. law and whether or not the ordering of this military action in Venezuela was constitutional from a U.S. legal perspective, right? You guys have your constitution. It's one of the most beautifully written constitutions anywhere in the world. I'm a big admirer of the U.S. Constitution, but it clearly has, powers that are meant for Congress and powers that are meant for the executive branch, i.e. President of the United States. Now, my understanding is that under your constitutional rules, obviously the right to actually declare war is essentially in the hands of Congress. But at the same time, the president, as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, does have some leeway in conducting essential military operations that are needed for the safety and security of the United States, as long as they're not prolonged armed conflicts. And to try to be objective here, there are no boots on the ground, at least official boots on the ground in Venezuela at this point. We know Donald Trump had authorized CIA, kind of like black op operations in Venezuela. So we assume the CIA still has a presence there. There are some rumors in Venezuela that you still have some Delta Force personnel, maybe somewhere in the country. But this is not Iraq. Like, people have to understand that there was no massive U.S. invasion. So the legality under the U.S. Constitution, I think, can still be debated. I mean, I obviously would defer to my American colleagues, and I think there should be, hearings, and there should be really a debate in the United States as to whether or not, this was within the Constitution of the United States. But I think there could be a debate there. Where it's more black and white is in the second dimension, which is international law. And this is the law that governs the relations between states. So now we're no longer talking about the U.S. Constitution, but we're talking about how the U.S. really engages with and trades with and establishes relationships with other nations of the world. And here, it is much more difficult to justify. So for the viewers who maybe are not aware of this, so after World War II, as Cyrus correctly pointed out, the world order was changed. We see the emergence of the United Nations. And with the United Nations, we see the United Nations Charter. And essentially, the United Nations Charter is one of the fundamental documents of international law. And the system was built, remember, with the trauma of World War II in mind. The system was built to make it very difficult for there to be a full-scale, state-on-state international conflict like what we saw in World War II. And so essentially, there are very narrow paths for there to be armed military action that is actually within the scope of international law. The premise of international law is no sovereign state can attack another sovereign state, right? That's the baseline idea. We're all sovereign. All the peoples of the world have the right to self-determination. Therefore, a bigger country with a stronger military coming in, taking over a smaller country and telling it what to do, that's a no-no, basically, in international law. However, there are a handful of exceptions. Notable exceptions include self-defense. So if you're legitimately attacked by another state, you have the right, within certain rules, to defend yourself. Therefore, you can push your attackers back, you can regain your territory. And then you have collective self-defense, which is kind of like an offshoot to that, when a state actually requests assistance from other states to defend itself. A great example of that is, for example, Kuwait back during the first Gulf War, when the US-led coalition organized Operation Desert Storm and actually helped Kuwait regain control of its territory and its sovereignty after Saddam Hussein at the time had invaded it. And then there's another narrow path, which is when the United Nations Security Council determines that military action should and can be taken. And there are certain rules around that. I'm not going to get into all the details. It's very technical. But that UN Security Council authorized action hardly ever happens, because in the UN Security Council, you have 5 permanent members. 3 of those are China, Russia, and the US. And those 5 permanent members have veto rights. So whenever you have a draft resolution in the UN Security Council that essentially proposes, military action or some kind of sanction-related action against an ally of any of these 3 nations I've just mentioned, essentially by voting no on the draft resolution, these countries essentially kill and veto the resolution right then and there. Even if every other member of the UN votes yes, as long as the US or Russia or China votes no, then the bill dies there. And it's not even a bill, it just stays at the state of draft. Now, the other 2 P5 members are France and the UK. They used to be much more relevant in global politics back when the UN was formed, 1945. We don't see them being as large as players as they used to be, but they are technically still there. And so that's why this attack on Venezuela, coming back to our original point, is difficult to justify, because was Venezuela posing an imminent threat to the United States? I don't know. The U.S. is much more powerful, right? I don't see Venezuela posing an imminent threat to the United States. And
I would confidently say no. There's no threat to the United States. I think that's preposterous, to be honest.
Yeah, and then to my knowledge, the United Nations Security Council had not authorized this. And remember, Maduro was a close ally to China and Russia. So if this had even gone to the UN, I would presume that in the context of the Security Council, China and Russia would have rapidly vetoed any resolution or potential resolution, which would have, potentially put Maduro in harm's way. So from an international law perspective, at least with the existing rules, it seems like this, there's big room to believe that this action was not lawful under the scope of the UN and current international law.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that this is something that's been really trending for the last couple of years, Javier, because, if we actually go back and we look at, for example, the United States' closest ally, obviously, is Israel. And Israel, has had a very, very gruesome war against the Palestinians. The entire Gaza conflict has been a stain on humanity, as far as that this is an act of genocide that the United States has, certainly supported. But the problem with this, Javier, is that, I think let's just say if this was a car going down the road, the wheels were starting to come off with the whole Israel thing, because, the United States, we have a track record of, the rules apply to thee and not to me. And, we constantly see this this double standard with the United States government. We see the United States, saying, look, Russia, you're not allowed to go into Ukraine because we have, exactly what the framework that you just said, right? If you want to declare a war, we have rules, right? And if you, in order to have rules, you need to, if we want to live in a peaceful society and international society where every member state is safe, then, we need to, adhere to these rules. Now, the problem is that we have, basically, there's a lot of people that don't follow the rules, but the biggest one is the United States itself. And so you constantly see the United States, I think that they're, if we look at, for example, even in Latin America, if we look at the history, I mean, there's been no shortage of regime change operations throughout Latin America, all started by the United States government. You see our efforts, we can start saying in Yemen and Libya and in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Even here in Panama, where I am now, is the closest example to what just happened in Venezuela. So I was actually talking to a friend of mine about this. He said, you can sure pick them, right? Because you're a Venezuelan citizen. The United States just took Maduro into custody. And back in 1989, if some of you guys maybe that are watching this were around back then, 1989, something very similar happened here where I am in Panama City now, where the United States actually came in under, if I'm not mistaken, this is George H.W. Bush, so Bush Senior administration, and at that time deposed Noriega. Also on very similar pretenses of, drug trafficking and so forth. Now, there are certain things that were a bit different. When the U.S. came into Panama, they rapidly decided to support the swearing in of an opposition candidate at the time who had won elections or had allegedly won elections. In that context, we're not seeing the same approach with Venezuela now. In Venezuela, it appears that they're taking an approach more prioritizing stability and not necessarily regime change, but more leadership change is what we're seeing in Venezuela now. But definitely what you're saying is true within the context of the Cold War, and now within the context of this new, I would say, multilateral world order, we're seeing the United States really being at the forefront of essentially giving countries a little bit of a push when policies need to change, in their view.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think kind of going back to, Javier, I do want to touch on the next thing. Next topic here would be about the oil, and I think this is a very big story. And I certainly want to get your insights into this, because I know that you have worked for is it right that you've worked for an oil company before, and in a kind of a legal manner, and you definitely have a lot of good insights that I think is going to be very interesting to share. Before you share that, I do have an interesting clip that talks specifically about the oil that we'll be able to play. But yeah, I mean, kind of to wrap up this opening point here is, I think that it's very difficult for the United States now on the international world order to really have the respect and to really, to be able to even say, look, we have a system, we have the United Nations, we have international rules-based order, we have these systems and processes in place. Basically, Donald Trump has thrown that out the window, and it has really opened the world to a very dangerous precedent, because, this is a very, very clear violation of international law. And I think what I opened the stream up for those of you that have many joined here. We've got around 830 people here in the stream. Appreciate every one of you being here tonight as we continue to talk about this very pressing news story. But I opened the stream and I said, I think that Donald Trump is getting very desperate, and I want to, make my case for this. So if you look at Donald Trump, his numbers are absolutely crashing right now in the United States as far as his poll numbers. The United States economy is not in a good position. And the unfortunate thing is that we can't get an accurate measure of what the economy is doing because of, simply Donald Trump has fired so many people in the organization that gives these correct updates. And, we see a lot of this manipulation. The numbers aren't good. Let's go ahead and fire the budget committee. We don't like this. We're going to fire this department. Even for example, even if you are pro regime change, even if you took the stance of, look, I love that America went in there, because I want Venezuela to have a better regime change. Well, we fired the entire USAID, which would be the organization that could actually fund this and actually make changes abroad. So we wouldn't have the resources to do it anyways. So again, even if that was your stance, well, Donald Trump's fired the very department that would actually be in charge of that. So that wouldn't work either. So there's a lot of problems here for the United States. But I think what this does as well is, we still look at the Epstein files. The Epstein files, I think, is a very big problem. I think there's a lot of information that has been leaked from these files that are really, honestly, I think it would have really caused any other president to probably be impeached by now. But for some reason, Donald Trump has an incredible ability to have this absolute dictator-like control over his constituents. No Republican is able to really stand up, really able to challenge him. He has this incredible control over the Republican Party. And, he is basically, I think this is a very large distraction. And again, we can sell this to the American people that, hey, look at our Delta forces. There's not another army or military power in the world that could operate this precisely, this accurately, this grand. And, from a military perspective, like you said, I mean, they did a great job. I mean,
from a military strategy perspective, it was lovely. It was executed in a lovely manner. I will give recognition to the United States Armed Forces. I do think that was top notch in terms of how it was managed from a technical perspective. Now,
for sure,
the legality of it is a separate, definitely a separate debate. But in terms of the aircraft, the coordination, the weapons, the entire intelligence community that actually managed to track down President Maduro, all of that was absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and when you're spending $1 trillion a year on military, you're going to have that. I mean, that's certainly that's certainly the United States' forte, for example. But I think that this is a very large distraction, that Donald Trump is basically trying to do, because there's a lot of things at play. And Javier, kind of goes back to what we started our conversation a couple of months ago in Malaysia, where we talk about the rise of BRICS. We talk about the multipolar world that we now live in. And I think what we're seeing right now is, I think we're seeing basically Donald Trump trying to say, we are going to have these spheres of influence. And for example, if you look at Marco Rubio's comments about Venezuela are all about the Western Hemisphere. And this is kind of an interesting thing here, Javier, because what I've noticed in a lot of my comments, I'll make a video, for example, said, why Latin America, chose China, or why Brazil chose China, why these countries are moving strategically closer to China. Many of you know who follow this channel, I talk a lot about China specifically. But the interesting thing is, if you look at, for example, Brazil, why are they importing so many BYD cars? Well, the BYD cars are incredible pieces of technology at a very affordable price rate, and that is going to give the Brazilians a strategic advantage in their long-term future. Hence, they're partnering with with China, for that technology. Yes. And so what's interesting though, Javier, is you'll see some U.S. politicians that will say a line like, "We can't have China operating in our own backyard." And I've noticed this for many people in Latin America. They absolutely hate that term when an American politician says my own backyard, because it's like, well, you don't get to own and control the entire Western hemisphere. But in reality, I think that's exactly what Donald Trump wants to do. He's going to say, look, nobody's going to operate the Western hemisphere. We don't want to have any China, Russia. We don't want you guys over here. I think that you got to be on high alert for, for example, I think Marco Rubio's dream has always been to, get involved with Cuba, potentially throw a revolution there. Donald Trump has said in a White House interview, I actually have this call. This is an interesting clip. This is a 29-second clip. Everybody, let's listen to this clip where Donald Trump talks specifically about Colombia.
That's Venezuela. It's very sick. Colombia is very sick, too, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, and he's not going to be doing it very long, let me tell you.
What does that mean? He's not going to be doing it very long?
He's not doing it very long. He has cocaine mills and cocaine factories. He's not going to be doing it very long.
So there will be an operation by the U.S. and
it sounds
Colombia?
good to me.
Secretary Rubio mentioned Cuba yesterday.
They kill a lot of people, yeah.
Secretary Rubio.
So I hope that everybody was able to hear that, but the reporter basically was talking about Colombia, and he said, the leader there is not a good man, and he's not going to be operating there for a very long time. The reporter said, so are we going to have an operation there? Which Donald Trump reported, sounds good to me. And so, it's an interesting one because, again, I think we all know this, that Donald Trump speaks off the cuff, right? He's just going to say it as it is. He doesn't have a filter. But the problem is when you're the sitting president of the United States and the most powerful man in the world, you can't just talk about a sovereign nation and be like, yeah, are we going to have a military operation there? Sounds good to me. Why not? Let's go for it.
Maybe, why not? Yeah.
Why not?
But I will say one thing here, Cyrus, which is I think a lot of times many people in the U.S. give themselves a very hard time for these quote unquote imperialist policies. But you have to acknowledge that while in Latin America, we don't like to be called the backyard of the U.S. or something like that, we do in many cases acknowledge that U.S. influence has also brought many good things, right? I think that you also have to acknowledge that, for example, in the case of my homeland, Venezuela, the oil industry was largely built thanks to transfers of technology that were brought in largely by American companies. And if you talk to my mother's generation, for example, they have tremendous respect for the United States and a lot of, warm feelings and thankfulness towards the United States. I can tell you here in Panama, of course, there are mixed feelings. There are people who remember that day back in '89. And of course, there were horrible things that happened. But many people here in Panama are happy that the U.S. at one point, came in and transitioned Panama from Noriega to another president. A lot of people in Panama also are very thankful for the Americans to have initially, done everything to actually operate the Panama Canal. Now it's in the hands of Panamanians. And we also heard Donald Trump make a couple of comments earlier in his presidency about the Panama Canal. That's a whole separate issue. But my point is, let's not forget that the U.S. has also done very good things. I think nobody is entirely bad or entirely good. And I personally think the U.S. has also influenced the region in many positive ways. And that's something that you also have to take into consideration, even with the Venezuela issue. Like I can sit here as a lawyer and talk about from the legal perspective how international law and geopolitics may be affected. But the reality is a lot of my countrymen, many of my countrymen who have been, outside of Venezuela in many cases for a decade plus, were celebrating on the streets, not only in Panama City, but in Miami and New York and Madrid. People in Venezuela, many of those people there saw this as a liberation day. So you also have to take into consideration that a lot of people welcome these actions. Now, is it everyone? No, you're never going to have a 100% consensus. But I think that drives me back to my earlier point. You can never say U.S. entirely bad guy or U.S. entirely good guy. There are always good things and bad things. And depending on who you are and where you are in the world, you may see it as something good. A lot of my countrymen who have not been back to our homeland in 10 plus years don't care about international law. They don't care about the United Nations and the Charter and self-defense. They just care that the man that in their vision drove them out of their homeland, separated their families, has now been deposed. And that is something that I think, is worth understanding, that there are always these different perspectives.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting counter argument to that, because I think there's like we'll talk about it with China as well, because there's a lot of Chinese that are outside of China that would certainly talk against the Chinese government, and I'll give you a very interesting example. I was actually exchanging tweets with this lady who's she's ethnically Chinese. I think her name is Shi Van Fleet, I believe is her name on Twitter. And, she's an older lady. I'd say she's probably in her 60s or 70s. She and her whole thing is that, she says, her entire platform on Twitter is that she talks about, I know what it's like to grow up under Chairman Mao's China. And, this is, China is trying to, spread Chairman Mao's ideology across America. And I said, the problem with this type of Chinese person is that they left China 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago. So like the China of 50 years ago is nothing like the China of today. And the problem with that argument is that if you haven't been back to China in 40, 50 years, you honestly can't comment on China, because we're not talking about Chairman Mao's China. Chairman Mao's China doesn't exist anymore. Right.
Correct.
I totally empathize with you, because if you growing up in China in the 1960s, yeah, it was poor and it sucked. Life was not good there, but the thing is that it was going through a difficult period of time, where the country was, was changing. There was a lot of changes coming, and certainly, there was brighter times ahead. And so I think that's kind of the issue, where I see a lot of people that are overseas, that become, very, very polarized against their ancestral land and that. So there's always a bit of context. Right. I don't think, I'm right or you're right, or I'm, there's always a little bit of, the biggest word that I like to use in geopolitics is always nuance, so it's always about understanding a little bit of nuance and stuff. So again, when I was exchanging these tweets with this lady, we're talking about this, she's like, oh, you don't know China like I do. And I would say, I will argue that point, because I think I know China better than you. Because if you haven't been to China in 40, 50 years, I don't think you can comment on China today. That's just a stance that I'm going to take on that. But, Javier, this brings us to an interesting point. We've had an amazing live stream. We're close to 1,000 people in the stream. And I want to talk to you specifically about oil, because I think that, Donald Trump has made it very clear. He's been very vocal that, he has said there's obviously a tremendous amount of resources, a lot of oil resources. It's also the hard crude oil, which is actually benefits the United States, because we have a lot of refineries in the United States that can actually process that oil. And, actually there was a tweet that went viral. And I can't bring up the tweet. I'm going to actually find this tweet. I think it's quite interesting. I'm going to tell you this tweet. I'm going to play a clip from Donald Trump Jr. and also, Machado, who talks about the oil industry, which I think is very interesting. But basically, they said, there was a tweet here that says the oil companies were informed about an act of war before it happened. Congress was not. That, my friends, is what an authoritarian regime run by oligarchs looks like. I think the oil is a big play here. Javier, I'm going to play a clip here. It's about 55 seconds long. Let's just listen to as we talk about the oil. As soon as we go after this clip, I'd like to get your thoughts on the oil industry specifically.
Forget about Saudi Arabia. Forget about the Saudis. We have more oil. Infinite potential. And we're going to open markets. We're going to kick off the government from the oil sector. We are going to privatize all our industries. Venezuela has huge resources: oil, gas, minerals, land, technology. And as you said before, we have a strategic location, hours from the United States. So we're going to do this right. We know what we have to do. And American companies are in, super strategic position to invest. This country, Venezuela, is going to be the brightest opportunity for investment of American companies, of good people that are going to make a lot of money.
All right. there we have it. The Nobel Prize winner Machado, talking about how rich the reserves are. Obviously, a tremendous amount of oil there in Venezuela. And I think that the whole play here would be, and this is exactly what Marco Rubio said, is that we don't want to have countries like Russia and China getting access to this oil because it is in the Western Hemisphere. And again, it goes down to my theory that really, I believe that Donald Trump is wanting this sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. He wants everything in the Western Hemisphere to run through the United States, and he definitely doesn't want to have China or Russia having access to that. And so I think there's a big play with that. We haven't even talked about Greenland yet, which I absolutely think that Trump is going to make a move on. And if you don't believe it, I definitely think that Trump is going to make a move on Greenland very, very soon. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But what are your thoughts on this? Let's go from the legal perspective and just your thoughts on the oil industry, what Machado said in this clip, and what the future of this is.
Well, listen, like everything within the legal sphere, and especially in the international legal sphere, it's always complicated. It's not black and white. So first of all, yes, she's correct in saying Venezuela has tremendous oil reserves. They're humongous. Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia, than Qatar, than the UAE. I think name any country in the world, Venezuela has more oil. In addition to that, Venezuela is also the jackpot in terms of natural resources, with tremendous reserves of gold and diamonds and rare earth minerals that are becoming more important for those AI data centers. Natural gas, I think we're third in the world. So definitely Venezuela is a huge win for anyone who is natural resource hungry, right? That is very, very important to take into consideration. Now, the Venezuelan oil industry has unfortunately been in a sharp decline throughout essentially my lifetime. So in the early 2000s, we had a decent oil production, so to speak. In 1999, when we rewrote the Constitution under Chavez, just after the 1998 election, if memory serves, we had about 3 million something barrels per day being produced in Venezuela, maybe 3.5 if memory serves. At one point that dropped to 300,000 barrels per day under Maduro, and it's been slowly going up, in recent years. And I believe we recently hit a mark of about 1 million, slightly under 1 million. Now, the Venezuelan oil industry, if you want to analyze it, it's very complex. You've got American oil companies that were historically there and that largely left Venezuela after the 2007 oil reforms by President Chavez. Some of them had their assets nationalized and confiscated and taken. Others simply decided to pack up and leave. It depends on a case-by-case basis. That generated a lot of issues. And then during the 2010s, you essentially had a progressive introduction of U.S. sanctions that have severely limited Venezuela's possibility to essentially rebuild its oil industry. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg type situation. Yes, the sanctions make it very difficult for Venezuela to actually rebuild its oil industry and to get oil production back up. But at the same time, those sanctions were, in a way, in direct response to Venezuela's treatment of foreign investors in the past, and also Venezuela's treatment of, protesters and political opposition, et cetera, within the country, which also justified a series of economic sanctions, first under Obama, and then obviously much more sharply under the Trump administration, both during the first term and during the second term. And only briefly under President Biden's presidency did we see a slight relaxation of certain sanctions that allowed actually Chevron to retake certain projects in Venezuela as the last remaining American oil giant in Venezuela. So definitely a very interesting geopolitical situation down there with the oil interest, Russia and China being predominantly present, China under Chavez, I believe, becoming the largest buyer of Venezuelan crude. The Russians are obviously present on the ground there as well. So, I mean, it is obviously a very complex situation. And in addition to that, not only is there an abundant reserve of oil, but there is also extra heavy crude, which is precisely what many American refineries, that are built all along the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, et cetera, are actually built to process. So, American oil production is at all-time highs. But my understanding is in the United States, you're mainly producing light crude. And a lot of these refineries that have been built, and you can't just build refineries, from in 24 hours. A lot of these refineries are actually ideally built to import, receive, and refine Venezuelan heavy crude. So I believe that all of this actually ties in beautifully into a strategy whereby if you control this oil, then yes, ultimately, you can feed it back to the American economy. And tying it back to what Donald Trump has just done, I mean, you look at his speech right after the U.S. military action. I think he mentioned oil and wealth and American oil companies much more than he did democracy or nation building or transition or anything like that. And in fact, currently, the Maduro vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who has now been sworn in as the acting president of Venezuela, she's still in command. So the Maduro government apparatus is still in control in Venezuela. And
Right.
what the American government has done is essentially play their cards to pressure them into negotiating the entry of American oil companies. So it appears that they're very honest about oil and rare earth minerals being the main objective. And they've been very clear on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, I think there's no doubt about this, that it certainly benefits the United States. I mean, I think there's a huge advantage for, like you said, I mean, you know, we can put two and two together, right? We have the refineries in the United States that could specifically, process this very heavy crude from Venezuela. But my concern here is that, Javier, I want to get your thoughts on this, is that, are the Venezuelan people going to benefit from this? I mean, are they going to actually, benefit from this, or is it just going to be more Americans? I mean, yeah, it works. You said it works beautifully. I think it does work beautifully for the United States, but I'm more worried for the people of Venezuela because, I'm very outspoken on geopolitics. I take a very, bold stance on times. I mean, I'm definitely not for United States regime change, mainly from the fact that I don't think there's a single case study that we can examine where the situation is actually improved, for the people. Now, again, this is not me saying that, Maduro is an excellent leader and that he should be he's the best thing to ever happen to Venezuela. I don't actually know enough about Venezuela to take that stance, but I do know that, if we look at, many of the conflicts in the Middle East, you look at, we go to Libya, we go to Afghanistan, we go to these other countries. I don't believe that the what was better before or after the United States was intervening in their country and replacing their leaders. And, there's always this thing of a message of democracy and liberty and freedom. These are very loose terms that are thrown out there, but I think, we have a big issue in the United States where I feel that, I don't feel that democracy is doing very well in this country. I don't feel that a lot of people feel a lot of liberty here. I certainly don't feel like a lot of people don't have a lot of freedom here, because of kind of the regime that is in power right now. And, again, these guardrails that are being absolutely destroyed because of our Constitution and simply the Trump, an interesting one here. And if we have any Europeans that are in the chat, this would be my message to the Europeans. And this is a very interesting one is, we saw a clip from Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz from Canada, he was born in Canada, but he's actually from Texas. But
he
Ted
renounced his
Cruz,
Canadian citizenship, I believe, right?
he did. Yeah, he had to renounce, in order to become a senator, because I don't think you're going to be able to win an election in Texas, if you're holding a Canadian passport. But yeah, he did renounce. He was born, I think he was born in Alberta, which is funny enough called the Texas of Canada. That's a big oil. Speaking of oil, that's where all the Canadian oil is in Alberta. But but Ted Cruz said something very interesting. He said, hey, Denmark, we've had a great relationship with you, but I want to have a conversation. And they said, well, we can have a conversation, but just so you know, Greenland's not for sale. And he said, well, everything's for sale, and guess what? Either you sell now or you might not get anything for it. And we might just take it from you, And so it's kind of like, I just really cannot stand that part of the United States. I just cannot stand that American arrogance. I think that is just a really big stain on our country. I find it quite embarrassing as a United States citizen that we have our politicians would speak like that. But I do think that a precedent has been set because right now we have all the European nations minus Spain. Spain has been the one country that has been vocal about, what we've talked about today, which is the international law, due process, exactly what this world needs to have, these guardrails in place. But, we have countries like the United Kingdom, France, Germany, who have basically just stood by and been like, I don't know, basically we'll kind of let Trump do whatever he wants to do. So I definitely think that, kind of going to my theory of these spheres of influence, and I think Greenland fits very much into Donald Trump's sphere. I think he's going to take it. I think he's going to make a move on it. And I think it's going to be a very interesting thing because if we look at that situation, Javier, we're looking at, Greenland is a member of NATO. It's owned by Denmark, and it is it is actually, it would be a NATO ally attacking a NATO ally, which would just be unprecedented. And I think it could destroy the entire NATO organization as well.
Correct. Yeah, no, definitely very interesting. Now, your original question was, how do I view, basically the transition post U.S. interventions, all of that. Listen, I am usually a guy who champions sovereignty of nations. I believe each nation has to resolve its own issues. And I believe that usually foreign intervention is not something that should generally be seen as positive unless it is definitely coordinated in a legitimate and in a very organized manner. So in general, I would say that there is always good things and bad things, but I am more inclined to say that general, like brute force interventions do not yield as many positive things for the local population. I think overall, if you're going to see major investment into, in this case, the Venezuelan oil industry, I think you're rapidly going to see macroeconomic data perform well. You're going to see an increase in GDP. You're going to see an increase in economic activity, and that generally overall will benefit the population. However, what we usually see time and time again is that it disproportionately benefits the elites, at least at first, and then it usually trickles down to the rest of the population more slowly. I mean, I for example, was definitely on the ground and living full-time in Venezuela when Chevron was allowed to prompt up part of its operations in Venezuela, and I did see a general economic progress during that time, even for average Venezuelans, but it definitely was it was slower for average Venezuelans than it was for the actual elite that is closer to that source of money. So generally speaking, I would say, yes, self-determination is something important. The sovereignty of nations is something important. And I believe that as Venezuelans, we have to do what is best for our country. Now, at the same time, we have to acknowledge that many Venezuelans have been grieving for a very long time and have been asking the international community to take action. And unfortunately, the current international system we have is just not designed for nation building or supporting democracy necessarily. We have a system that is generally built to favor stability and to prevent nation on nation and state versus state conflicts. So should this be a wake-up call for the international community to maybe update the international order or international laws to include some kind of mechanism other than the ones we have now to deal with situations like the one we have in Venezuela? Maybe, but that's an entirely separate debate.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So Javier, I mean, we're kind of coming to, kind of the hour segment on our stream. I think we've had a, fantastic discussion. I'm still very worried about, the legal ramifications and kind of what Trump has done. And I'm also worried because, he has a couple more years left on his presidency. So who knows, what we're going to get into. But I do think that it opens the door to a lot of other questions that are going to have to be answered. For example, I think, I kind of mentioned earlier in the stream when I talked specifically about Israel and how, the United States, we try to play both sides a lot of times. For example, we'll condemn Russia and say, look, Russia, you're not allowed to go into Ukraine. But, we basically give, Benjamin Netanyahu the pass to kind of do whatever he wants to do in Palestine. We know that, tens of thousands of innocent women and children have been slaughtered and, killed, many civilians targeted. I mean, it's been a tragedy over there, but, we kind of see this double standard going on. And I think that you're going to see, a little bit more aggressiveness around the world, from potential other powers. Now, one of the questions that I get a lot is, did this basically give a green light to China? Is China going to walk in and are they going to take Taiwan? Interesting enough, I made a video about that specifically. That's my last uploaded video. So if you check my channel, you can talk about that, where I actually bring in another professor, Professor Jiang Xueqin, who many of you know, very prominent YouTuber. And we talk specifically about that on why I think, Taiwan is nowhere close to anything like Venezuela. So I think it's a very big can of worms. But I want to kind of let's kind of do some final thoughts here. So Javier, I'm gonna give you your kind of final thoughts of the situation, and then I'll close this out with my closing comments, and then we'll kind of I'm gonna end the stream by playing that clip from Republican Thomas Massie one more time, and then we'll let you guys go. But I do want to thank everybody. We had an amazing panel in here today. Javier, you've been awesome to listen to. And also, I think it's been great for our chat. And for everybody in the chat, I'm going to be getting back into our live streams in 2026. I'm going back home in a couple of days. I'm actually building out a new YouTube studio. You can see I'm on the road. I'm in my hotel room at the moment, but this is so important to get this live stream today. But I'm looking forward to putting out a weekly show for you guys, a weekly live stream, all things geopolitics to kind of keep the momentum going. But Javier, kind of wrap everything up on what you think on what you've seen, what you think, and where you think the future is going in your closing segment here. Take as long as you like.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Cyrus, so much for this, this lovely live stream, truly. And thank you to everyone that has tuned in. I mean, ultimately, this is about informing people and helping people arrive in their own conclusions and making their own decisions. I think that we are really in changing times. Honestly, the international world order is changing. I think things like what the U.S. Did recently with Venezuela and taking a sitting Venezuelan leader into custody, that is really something that should make us think, should make us review the international world order and the international system as it exists today and see potentially how it can be improved. And from the business perspective, as people who trade internationally, who invest internationally, understanding the world order is also key to keeping our wealth protected, our assets safe, and ultimately anticipating what we can do to stay safe individually. Because unfortunately, the reality is that people like you and me, people like most of our viewers, we're not really going to be able to influence in a great deal what happens at this very high level of international order. All we can do is prepare, be ready, and just adapt to the changing circumstances. And that's why I invite everyone to stay alert and to basically anticipate as best they can what is happening in the world so they can prepare and stay safe.
Absolutely. And I think, you know what, I had a good comment from Raymond here, one of our fans, who said, chatting about it is good because we can crowdsource different point of views. I definitely, agree with that. And I do want to give a chat. I'm going to put a link to your guys' YouTube channel here in the chat here, guys. So Javier and his business partner have started a really interesting YouTube channel. I put the link down there as well. It's been simultaneously streaming on their channel as well, where you guys can check out. He has some very good insights. Javier is a lawyer, tax expert, and very, very international man. We've always enjoyed our chats, Javier. And again, as I come to the conclusion of the stream, I want to leave everybody with my final thoughts. I do think the last 48 hours is going to have some very big consequences for the future of our world. But I'm actually very worried for the United States because I think that we are going down a very difficult path moving forward with Donald Trump as president. We see him time and time again, making these very dangerous moves. I think in the last 48 hours, we have, made an act of war by bombing another sovereign country, taking that leader and, bringing him to New York to file, to face these charges that I don't really think that that would actually hold up under international law. We've threatened to put troops on the ground in Mexico. We've threatened to have an operation in Colombia. We've threatened to take Greenland. And so we see, a lot of my European friends have messaged me. My phone has been blowing up the last 2 days. A lot of people messaged me just like, Cyrus, what is actually going on in the United States right now? Like, it seems Donald Trump has lost his mind. And I think there's a lot of Americans that are very concerned about this as well. I'm always concerned when we talk about regime change. I would agree with your statement, Javier, that if there is a organic movement for a change in government, that almost always provides a much more stable outcome. I think that we can look at the 70 plus regime change operations that the United States has done around the world from the early 1900s to up into the late 1990s. There's not been a track record of success there. I think that if you want to make the argument that the United States is a country that that honestly is supports the international rules-based order and that is a model for the world, I don't think you can make that argument. I think the United States is going down a road where we're becoming very isolated on the world stage, and I believe that's why that Donald Trump is making these very drastic moves. We've talked about this in our live streams, Javier, or in our videos before, our interviews rather, but why is an organization like BRICS, why is this gaining so much momentum? Why is it that last year in 2025, when we look at international surveys, we see a record number specifically of the youth, most importantly, but even record numbers of countries around the world. There are more countries in the world now that have a more favorable view of China as opposed to the United States. Now,
Correct.
Sometimes people will take that and say, Cyrus, you're being anti-American. I'm not. I'm actually a concerned American because I would like my
You're just
reputation of
looking
my
at the
country.
facts. Yeah.
I just report facts. And I mean, that is what our entire YouTube channel has always been based on, facts and logic. And so, some people will take a look at that and say, Cyrus, that's propaganda. I said, no, it's actually a Pew Research Center who has gone around the world, interviewed tens of thousands of people in, 40 different countries. And here's the data that we can look at. And here's what it's saying. So again, instead of, writing this off and saying that this is anti-American propaganda, let's look at the data and let's try to figure out, why are we going down this road? How can we correct it? I do think that there's many positive things in America. I mean, I am a U.S. citizen. I do love my country, very frustrated at my government. And I think a lot of people are reaching that point. So, I think today's live stream was important because it gives us a very good time to talk about these things. I think dialogue is always good. I think learning different perspectives. And Javier, I love learning from you because, again, you're a Venezuelan, you have a lot of experience, and I want to thank you for that. So everybody, make sure that you check out his YouTube channel. Make sure that we're going to continue to do more live streams in the future. Like I said, we're going to be building a more consistent weekly show here on YouTube. That way that you guys have a dedicated time, that you guys know that I'm going to be going live, that we can provide you the best insights into geopolitics and, give you the content that you guys enjoy. So Javier, I want to just say thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me, Cyrus. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you. And thank you to everyone.
Absolutely. Well, guys, I think the best clip here, we're going to end it with this clip that we opened up. This is Thomas Massey. I think his comments here are really spot on. So I want to thank you all. I'm going to stay in the chat with everybody for a little bit. And we would look forward to seeing you guys in our next live stream very soon.
Mr. Speaker, James Madison warned us that in no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war and peace to the legislature and not the executive. Madison called it the crown jewel of Congress. The framers understood a simple truth. To the extent that war-making power devolves to one person, liberty dissolves. If the president believes military action against Venezuela is justified and needed, he should make the case and Congress should vote before American lives and treasure are spent on regime change in South America. Let's be honest about likely outcomes. Do we truly believe that Nicolás Maduro will be replaced by a modern-day George Washington? How did that work out? In Cuba, Libya, Iraq, or Syria, previous presidents told us to go to war over WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, that did not exist. Now it's the same playbook, except we're told that drugs are the WMDs. If it were about drugs, we'd bomb Mexico, or China, or Colombia, and the president would not have pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez. This is about oil and regime change. And when it comes to regime change, we've already been down this road with Venezuela with nothing to show for it. In 2019, we recognized Juan Guaido. We seized their embassy here in D.C. We were told that regime change was imminent. Years later, Maduro remains in power. Today, we're told to place our hopes in other exiled figures. Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado. I wish them well, I do. But Congress should not express moral sympathy in the form of a blank check for military escalation and American lives. And let's take a moment to acknowledge the contradiction at the heart of this policy. This administration tells us that the Maduro regime is made up of narco-terrorists, and by escalating toward war, we would predictably create countless refugees. At the same time, this administration has moved to end temporary protected status for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans and deports them back to the very regime it condemns. So which is it? Are we prepared to receive swarms of the 25 million Venezuelans who will likely become refugees and billions in American treasure that will be used to destroy and inevitably rebuild that nation? Do we want a miniature Afghanistan in the Western Hemisphere? If that cost is acceptable to this Congress, then we should vote on it as a voice of the people and in accordance with our Constitution. And yet today, here we aren't even voting on whether to declare war or authorize the use of military force. All we're voting on is a war powers resolution that strengthens the fabric of our republic by reasserting the plain and simple language in the Constitution that Congress must decide questions of war. I urge support for this resolution, and I yield.